Is Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris a communist, as her Republican presidential opponent Donald Trump alleges? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, which we've done at the Future of Freedom Foundation now for some 34 years with your great support, for which we're very appreciative. I'm joined by my co-host, who was actually Vice President of Academic Affairs when FFF first got started in 1989. And that's Richard Ebeling, Professor of Economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, so your classes are almost here, Richard. Understand that
Yes,
freshmen have
the
returned to the
school is
Citadel.
open. The Citadel is open. All the athletic students have been on campus for a couple of weeks, and now the freshmen are going through their orientation and learning all the hell of the military aspects. 5:30 in the morning, calisthenics, marching around the parade ground, and being sure that they salute and say, "Sir."
Well, I'm sure you're leading them in all of these endeavors, the 5:30 mornings and the runs and the marches and so forth, right?
Absolutely. Though, to be honest, since we had these things on campus today, I would early, so I did set my alarm for 6 o'clock. I was up at 6 o'clock.
All right, Richard. So, in any political race, maybe in any aspect of politics, there's always some humor that comes about if not intentional, unintentional. And we had one of those moments when President Trump called Kamala Harris a communist. And so this created kind of a furor, and especially with Paul Krugman, the columnist for the New York Times. He wrote an article, I forget the title of it, but it was something like, "Is Kamala Harris really a communist?" And he took Trump to task for claiming literally that Kamala Harris was a communist, and Krugman says, well, clearly he doesn't know what the term literal means, because everyone knows she's not a communist, a real communist. But then it provided the opportunity for him to go into socialism, and in which he kind of, talks about, well, the differences between socialism and communism, and that how America has socialist programs. And so I thought, well, this is a nice opportunity for you and I to discuss socialism, communism, the free market. You traveled to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and you've also been to China. I've been to communist Cuba, and then we live here in the United States under what really Krugman acknowledges are socialist programs. Social Security and Medicare being the premier examples, the crown jewels of American socialism. But it does raise interesting questions, and Krugman does raise interesting questions as to what is a free market economy, and at what point do you cross over, does a society cross over and become a socialist system? I'm not even really sure there's any black and white lines here. I do know that Social Security and Medicare really are socialist programs. But are they communist programs? So, let me just start out this by saying, to me, a communist program, well, communism and socialism are obviously very related. The way I think of a communist system is where you have total government ownership of everything. The means of production, the results of production, the homes, the businesses, everything is owned by the state. And people work for the state. Everybody works for the government. Now, I don't think you could ever find a purely communist system, because there'd be no resources by which to fund this thing. A communist system necessarily entails the need to pay people salaries, and that means production. And so I think there always has to be some private sector activity for them to plunder and loot in order to fund this communist system. but to me, that's a genuine communist system. And then you've got the socialist system where the state really lets people maintain private ownership, maybe of their homes or at least of their cars or their personal belongings, their clothing, and their food. And the state, but the state provides. The state takes money from some people in order to give it to other people. One concept would be on need. Whoever the government feels needs the money more, the government's going to confiscate and redistribute it to the people who need the money. Or another concept is just equalization of wealth, that everybody should be equal in a socialist society, where everybody has, meaning everybody has the same thing, the same amount of wealth, the same income. And so you confiscate excess wealth, or what is considered excess wealth and excess income, and you redistribute it to other people in order to equalize things. And of course, the gradual, in the beginning, when something like this happens, let's say you have another type of system, a free market system that produces tremendous wealth, as we saw in the 19th century America, but tremendous disparities of wealth also. In other words, everybody's better off, including the people at the bottom of the economic ladder, than they would be under socialism. But this upsets people because the free market produces an outcome where some people have more than other people. And so there's that envy and covetousness that kicks in. And so they say, oh, well, we now need to confiscate that which people have in excess and to equalize the wealth. Well, that in the beginning, when a society does that, it's all hunky-dory, like in Cuba when Castro took over, because there's a lot to confiscate and redistribute. So it looks like, oh, wow, socialism is fantastic. But over time, you end up shrinking the ability of that society to produce wealth. And so the pie to confiscate starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller until you end up with practically nothing. Everybody's equal, but everybody's equally poor. They're just striving to survive. And then you have a society that's basically free market, like the United States, but has these massive socialist programs, what we call the welfare state, that came into existence in the Franklin Roosevelt administration. The big crown jewels are Social Security, that was followed by Medicare and Medicaid in the 1960s. But then you've got education grants, food stamps, aid to the arts, bailouts, all the whole welfare transfer program that ends up doing just massive chaos to a society, not only in terms of the out of control spending, as we've seen, the deficit, so-called deficit, now about $2 trillion a year, but also the massive debt. We just going over $34 trillion in debt. And on top of that, of course, is the massive debasement of the currency, the inflation of the money supplied to finance all this spending and debt. So I think this humor that comes about, it provides a valuable lesson for us to do some examination here in terms of, is this the kind of society we want? Is this the kind of system we want? People are putting all their efforts and energies and focus on who should be the president, but that really isn't the solution. The solution is we need to focus on the system we have and determine whether this system that has been in place all of our lives, the welfare warfare state system, is a good system, and whether it's a bad system and should be replaced by a good system, which would be a free market, private property, limited government system. What do you think?
Well, I think a good way to approach this, and Krugman's argument of sneering at Trump and Musk for referring to Kamala Harris as a communist, is to understand the origin of the concepts and the ideas a little bit, if I can. The terms communism and socialism, and the way they came to be used over the last 200 years, really originated in the early 19th century. And they were versions of basically the ending of what was called commercial society, because the word capitalism hadn't really come into use yet. So commercial society was basically the market economy, and that it was the commercial society, capitalism, that was the cause of injustice, exploitation, on unfairness of wealth distribution, and that therefore there were these proposals on transforming the society. They would all become sort of agricultural communities. There would be industrial socialist societies, but all of them had the common belief that it was necessary to commonly own the means of production. That is, the people as some type of collective whole should own the means of production, land, resources, raw materials, capital equipment, as opposed to being privately owned for some who benefit while others do the work but suffer and are cheated. And even if you read sort of like the Communist Manifesto written by Karl Marx and his colleague, collaborator, Frederick Engels, which was published in 1847, 1848, it's called the Communist Manifesto, but the word socialism is used almost as a synonym in it. And for a good part of the 19th century, socialism and communism were basically interchangeable words. That did not change really until the early part of the 20th century with the Russian or Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, because Lenin was part of a faction of the social democratic movement that believed that the capitalists would never give up their wealth and power and position peacefully or voluntarily, and therefore only violent revolution could overthrow the capitalist system and forcefully expropriate the means of production in the name of the proletariat, the people as a whole. But there were many socialists in the West, Germany, France, they were called the Labour Party in Great Britain, who believed in basically the same ideals, nationalization of the means of production, centralized planning, quote, a fairer distribution of the commonly produced pie, but believed that this could be attained not through violence, but through democratic means, the ballot box. So you saw the Social Democratic Party in Germany, which already was developing this democratic version of trying to establish socialism in the last decades of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the Labour Party in Great Britain, the Socialist Party in France, for example. So you had this schism between, quote, the socialist-communists over the issue of what is the means to achieve our common goal, violent revolution or the ballot box rather than bullets. But through most of the 20th century, while their idea of the means to achieve the end differed, a violent revolution versus democratic elections to achieve power and transform the society through legislation, then they believed in basically the same goal, the need to nationalize, if not all, virtually all the means of production, to have some forms of centralized planning by government authorities and bureaucrats, and a more equitable distribution of wealth and direction of the resources into what would be good or needed by the people, as opposed to what capitalists wanted to produce in the name of profit. And that remained throughout the Cold War. So you had democratic socialists in France and Germany who basically believed in the same ideals, that is, the kind of preferred future society, but disapproved of the violence and the dictatorship of the Soviets, or the Soviet form of it. So basically, they had the same program. Now, what happened was, beginning in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, is that there became another issue among these democratic socialists in Germany, France, Great Britain. Was it necessary to follow a centralized planning role to achieve the desired goals? What were the desired goals? Well, was it the means of production being nationalized, or what the means of production could be used for? And the conclusion was, let us not have all this crudeness and weirdness and corruption and inefficiency that the Soviets have had with central planning. And the Western socialists did not give this up easily. It was a big battle in their own ranks. So now, like, finally, the British Labour Party took out of its manifesto, its agenda, the nationalization of the means of production. This was in the 60s or 70s. And what they said is that what they want is an activist government that redistributes, that regulates, that owns and plans certain essential industries, but basically the regulated market economy that will generate the wealth that will enable us to achieve the socialist ends of producing things that are good for the people as a whole and not necessarily what is good for the capitalist profit, assuming that those kind of dichotomies exist, and an equitable distribution of income. In other words, taking from the higher income people and redistributing it to those who we identify as lower or more deserving. So basically, what happened was that Western socialism transformed in this idea of social democracy into the interventionist welfare state. You don't need to kill the goose; let it lay the golden eggs, and then we'll use the state to use those golden eggs how we want or believe they should be used and applied and redistributed through the power of the state regulatory and fiscal and monetary policies. So when Krugman says is that Kamala Harris is not a communist, he's right. If you mean like the Leninist or Stalinist or Maoist models of organization of government, he's right. She may want a lot of centralized and national power in Washington, but you have to presume that she would want to be Lenin or Stalin or Mao and do away with even the imagery of democratic elections, or that she wants nationalization of the means of production, which they normally don't call for. What she is she's a social democrat. And it's important to realize that beginning in Germany in the late 19th century, where this term arose, what was meant is the democratic socialists. Okay, social democrats just mean democratic socialists. And that is what American and British socialism now mean today. Not necessarily the nationalization of the means of production. Let private business, lay all the golden eggs, and instead just redistribute them and determine their use through regulation. And so that is what she is. She's a democratic socialist. She's a social democrat, and in that sense, she is what, unfortunately, too many, not only the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party believe in. The Republicans, just as much as the Democrats, believe in a rather heavy-handed regulatory state, an interventionist state, a redistributive state. And this applies not just to things that come out of Donald Trump's mouth or his running mate Vance's mouth, but generally Republicans, as the years and the decades have passed in the post-World War II period, their agenda that used to be close to classical liberal libertarian, the government should be very limited. It should be strictly confined within the original Constitution, more or less. The market should either have no regulation or a very light degree of regulation, and wealth might have to be given to the very poor, but that is not the purpose of government, to redistribute wealth. So sort of like a 90% classical liberal view, if you will. But over the decades, like I said, since 1945, the Republicans have moved more and more into a direction of positions that used to be Democratic. And all that's happened is that the Democratic Party has moved further left, and the Republican Party just keeps moving in that same direction with a lag. So in a sense, to say of it, we're all democratic socialists now in the sense of the mainstream of the political parties. There is no one who proposes, advocates, make the case for, and is willing to come out and publicly say that the ideal of America should be liberal democracy, not socialist democracy. And that liberal democracy means, yes, a democratic government. It is good that a government is responsible to those over whom it holds political office on a regular electoral basis, but that the word liberal means the confining of what the majority can do to a very small narrow of necessary common functions, while leaving all other things to the individual decision-making and choices and voluntary arrangements of the people themselves inside and outside of the marketplace. And it is that liberal democratic ideal, as opposed to this socialist democratic ideal, that she does represent, that is not being presented. So we basically have two versions of social democracy being advocated in this election.
Yeah, well, you raise a lot of interesting points. Your point about the Republicans having simply adopted the premises of the socialist welfare state is very good. In fact, Krugman sort of alludes to this. He refers to something, I think it's called Operation Coffee Cup. that was being done by Republicans in the Lyndon Johnson era. And Ronald Reagan was giving talks against Medicare, and they were opposing Medicare and Medicaid, the adoption of these socialist programs. And I think even during the Roosevelt administration, there were Republicans opposing this dramatic shift in the direction of America. And I think it's important to emphasize that this was not only dramatic, it was really revolutionary. If you look, for example, at my favorite period of time in American history is 1890 to 1910. It's a remarkable period in terms of economic liberty is what you and I advocate. No income tax and no IRS. Now, why is that important? Well, because when they adopted the income tax in 1913, they essentially socialized the results of production. That is, that everybody's fruits of their earnings became now subject to the control of the state. So while the means of production were still privately owned, the state could decide how much of your income you would be permitted to keep. It was a permission system because they set the percentage. Sometimes they're nice and they let you keep more. Sometimes they're not so nice, and it's less. But they're setting the percentage. They're controlling the results of production. In that period of time that I outlined, 1890 to 1910, the state had no power to do that. The federal government had no power. They couldn't seize people's income. You could keep 100% of your earnings. You didn't have to worry about filing an income tax return or keeping track of your deductions. Revolutionary system. And then no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no mandatory charity. Charity was entirely voluntary. People were honoring mother and father and grandparents on a purely voluntary basis with their own money. And this is at church groups and neighborhood groups and charitable foundations and this type of thing. Totally different from what the socialist concept of Social Security, welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, that the state needs to take care of people because otherwise they'd be dying in the streets. Well, nobody was dying in the streets from the lack of socialism from 1890 to 1910. It was the most prosperous period in the history of the world, and also the most charitable system. When people were free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth, that was how the hospitals got built, and the museums and the opera houses and the libraries. And then there was no drug war, no massive immigration control system. Yeah, you had a government control system, but they let in about 98% of people that were coming in. Totally different system from what we have today, where you have a government controlled immigration control system. And I think that the one of the biggest achievements in the Roosevelt administration, where this revolutionary change took place towards socialism, or what is called the welfare state, where the state is assigned the duty of taking care of people, taking money from one group of people, giving it to another group of people through the force of taxation. That was a monumental change, but what came with this was the indoctrination. That you've got to tell people that this is still the free enterprise system, that nothing has changed fundamentally. And you've got to indoctrinate them. And that's where the advantage of public government school systems came into play. That as long as you teach people that Roosevelt was saving the free enterprise system with the adoption of the regulated economy, the managed economy, the government-controlled economy, and with the welfare state, as long as people could be made to believe that this was saving free enterprise, when in actuality it was the opposite, then everything would be fine. And so that indoctrination has stuck. I mean, everybody's convinced that nothing's changed fundamentally since the country was founded. It's still a free market, free enterprise system. Oh yeah, you've got these little socialist welfare state programs, but they're just minor. They don't really alter the fundamental nature of the American economic system. Well, they did alter it. They changed it completely from a free market system, as I described, from 1890 to 1910, to a socialist welfare state system. And the results have been disastrous. And I think one final point I'd like to make is that the concept of freedom is that as long as you live under socialism, you cannot legitimately be considered free. And so I think that's the thing that every person in America needs to confront. It's not just who do you think should be the president, Biden or Harris? It's do you want to be free and how bad do you want to be free? And if you want to keep these socialist programs intact, then you're essentially throwing in the towel. You're saying, I don't care about freedom. It's not as important to me as keeping socialism intact. And that's where the soul searching comes in on programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education grants, the whole kit and caboodle, the regulated society, the warfare state. In order to be free, you got to dismantle infringements on freedom. And once you say, Jacob, that's just, you're asking for too much. Those people in 1890, I just can't go with them. I got to stick with socialism. Okay. But you also have to acknowledge that you're giving up your one chance to live your one life in freedom.
You see, this fundamental problem is that people don't think they are losing freedom. I was just looking at some polls, and they were asking people about where they stood on certain policy issues. The poll's purpose, though, was without mentioning Republicans or Democrats, asked people on these issues, and they would ask, what do you think of a one-payer health care system, which basically means socialized medicine, blah, blah, blah. But then there was the thing is, should college be free? That is, the student should not have to pay tuition for their college education. Do you think that college should be free? And both Democrats and Republicans and independents all supported the idea that higher education should be free in a large majority number. Now, you see, the thing is, that's the mind change. Free means I don't have to pay for it. The government gives it to me. But the question that is never answered is that where do the resources, the funds, the sums of money come from to give it to you at a zero or less than full price? And that means that you have to be an advocate of taking what is the income and wealth that has been earned by others and transferring it to either yourself or to those who you deem as more worthy of it than the original earners of it. And therefore, you want the state to put its hand in the pocket of Peter to transfer that money to Paul. And that is what people don't understand. They're latching onto this word free as if it falls from the sky, as if it's fruit that you just shake a branch and the apple just falls on the ground for you to pick up and eat. The idea that wealth has to be first produced to be available for consumption and use, that work has to be done if you're going to enjoy the fruits that labor generates, that unless there are proper incentives of people see the benefits of work in the sense of the reward that they earn from the efforts that they put into it, and others have valued at it in the market. You're a barber, you're a shoe shine guy, you're a manager of an enterprise, you're an entrepreneur, that the wealth you've earned, as long as it's on a free market, is what others in the society believe your services have been worth to them, for which they've given you 50 cents, $1, $20, all of which add up to your hundreds of thousands or millions if you're in those categories. But as long as you've earned it honestly, the distribution of wealth is just. No one has stolen, no one has robbed, no one has defrauded. And if that's the case, then to take from them just because you think they have too much and you know how it should be used instead and for whom is basically an act of theft. But they cannot understand the link that for the government to give something free involves the hiring of the government as the agent who does the robbery for you. Because nobody that I know that I've ever met, and I don't meet very mafia types, but minus that, or no people I met, if I were to ask them, do you believe that it'd be okay for me to reach into your pocket and take all or part of the money in your wealth and just because I want it and would prefer to use it, or I think Joe should have it instead of you, they would be shocked, both as the thief and as the victim of the thief. Most people say, no, stealing is wrong. But this idea that the government does it sort of clears their mind, right? Cleans their hand, or frees their mind, their guilty conscience of basically doing what Bastiat argued a long time ago. A world in which you have a legalized plunder. The government now violates people's rights to their life and property, including their incomes, instead of protecting them. a system of legalized plunder. And people don't see that. Until you can make them see that connection again, it's very difficult to get them to challenge or question the legitimacy of the system.
Yeah, well, that's where the indoctrination takes place. I mean, I've got a confession to make based on what you just said, that before I discovered libertarianism, I was a liberal Democrat, like um, Kamala Harris, and like the Republicans and socialist Republicans, and I could not understand, Richard, why people objected to the government helping the poor. I just couldn't fathom that. How could people be so vicious? And what went through my mind was, this is the government's money. Why shouldn't the government put its money to good use the way everybody else does with their own money? You decide what to do with your money. Why shouldn't the government be free to help the poor with its money? It never occurred to me that the government gets its money in a way that's totally different from the private sector. It takes money by force. In the private sector, they get their money by providing goods and services that other people are willing to pay for. That's not how government gets its money. The government looks around and looks at all these private sector businesses and people and says, let's go take their money. And that's how government gets its money. And so until you recognize that, it's like, oh, well, what's the problem here? But once you do recognize it, and once I discovered libertarianism, and Bastiat, as you point out, Frederick Bastiat, the 19th century French free market legislator, libertarian, and that remarkable little book called The Law, it was one of the first books I read, that it just opened my eyes up. I said, my gosh, this is a revelation for me. Government is essentially stealing money from people, using its force not to fund its own operations. I mean, I remember in the early days, they were libertarians, when I first discovered libertarianism, they're saying, well, there's nothing wrong with taxation to fund the government's limited operations, like the courts and that sort of thing, the police. I question that, but at least there's a logic to it. But the welfare state is totally different, because the state is taxing to take money from one group of people and giving it to another group of people under the guise of this is charitable and this is care and this is compassion. But it's what you point out, the biggest problem we face here is the belief that this is a free society. Because if you've been indoctrinated from the time you were born that you live in a free society, then everything you look around and see in that society is freedom. They start a trade war with China. Oh, this is freedom. We live in a free society, so that's part of a free society. So whatever they do as part of a free society is considered part of the free society. So they're leveling sanctions against all these people around the world, Iran, Russia, Cuba, whatever. It's all freedom. And they have a drug war where they're putting people in jail for ingesting what they call harmful substances. It's freedom. They're taking money from one group of people to give it to seniors. That's freedom. And I think, my favorite quote, Richard, of all the quotes that I've ever learned in this movement is, the one by Johann Goethe. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. What greater slave than the slave that thinks he's free when he's there serving Caesar?
See, and there's that old, first remove the beam out of your own eye before you take the speck out of somebody else's. That biblical phrase, if I have the phrasing right, is like people understand this more when they look at other countries. Okay, they hold an election in Venezuela, and the president Maduro says it was a free election. I had my guys count the vote, and I won. And he has a lot of supporters. They think he was elected, but we all look at it from the outside and say, this is a manipulated thing. Or in Russia now, Putin was elected. The people chose it. Well, they banned opposing parties. Some were arrested who wanted to run. Others were killed who wanted to run. But I'm sure Russians said, yeah, the government does some things. What institution is perfect? But this is our government. It's protecting our freedoms. It's key. It's fighting our enemies. Uh, Otherwise, how can we remain a free country? And using that free in the broadest sense of including national independence. And the thing is that we see, how can you think you live in a free society? But they do, and that's the same thing. You here in America, you can't look at the American system as if you were a dispassionate observer outside and see how far it is from freedom, even though you can look at other countries and see its non-free aspects. And it's that inability of to look at yourself by the same standards that you often judge other countries and other peoples is a serious blind spot, a very serious blind spot.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it's that Lee Greenwood song. I forget the exact phrasing, but it goes something like, "Thank God I'm an American, because at least I know I'm free." And I bet you that if you went and did a survey in North Korea, 98% of the respondents would say, "We live in a genuinely free society." And you know what? They would mean it just as much as any American today means it when he says, "Thank God I'm an American, because at least I know I'm free."
That at the core of this, and we should not forget this, is the government socialized education system. The public education system is educational or schooling socialism. They own the means of production, right? They're public schools. They're the single employer of all the employees. They hire the teachers and the professors, right? And they acquire the money to fund and manage and direct this education through taxes taken from those who have been working. It is a socialist enterprise that has a plan, a central plan. And the central plan is to indoctrinate the youth of America in accepting a certain worldview about people themselves and the government in that society, and what therefore is good or right for the government to do, or how people should live. Now, it is true that there are disputes and debates, and you see this in school districts. Oh, who's going to elect to the local school board? Is it going to be our agenda or their agenda? Will we salute the flag or not salute the flag? Will we have sex education or no sex education? Will we have creationism or revolution? You can go all through these things, right? But why is there such a fight? Because it's a socialist system in which whoever is lucky enough to be in the educational board, the central planning agency at that level of determining the curriculum and how the things are taught, the pedagogy. Okay, having control of that enables you to indoctrinate all the little minds all the way up through the grades for them to see the world in a particular way. And that's mind indoctrination, and how you make good little citizens as the advocates of the planning are defining it.
Absolutely. And it's a tremendously successful system. I mean, that's really their goal, to create, as you pointed out, the good little citizen. And it's tremendously successful. And unfortunately, and I was a victim of that indoctrination. I went to the public school system. And so that's why I was saying that I had no idea that government didn't get its money like everybody else did. And that's the indoctrination. And that's what we need to break through. And that's a terribly difficult task, given that they keep churning out these people. And unfortunately, many people do not achieve the breakthrough that we libertarians achieve. They go all the way to their deathbed still thinking, "Oh, I'm a good little citizen living in a free society." So anyway, we're out of time, Richard. Let's wrap things up. But I'm glad you pointed out that in this conversation on socialism, the root cause of this problem is the socialist educational system.
Absolutely.
That people don't see as a socialist system; they see it as a free enterprise system. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in, and thanks for your support. You may have gotten your fundraising letter mid-year here. We could sure use your support here in mid-year. Thank you very much for helping us out. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.